Good morning. Ruth Smith was our beloved minister from September of 1961 to July of 1981. And after she retired from being our minister, she still attended our church and sat right over there, about 4 rows back where Grace is sitting. It was always wonderful to see her. She collected her sermons, a few of her sermons, in a book called We Never Went Out on Saturday Night, because she's busy writing. And this one is from many years ago, but when I read it, I was really struck by how contemporary it felt, and I thought it would be good to read. She says, "Good government and good citizenship are topics widely discussed these days in the year of the bicentennial celebration, 1975. This morning, she hoped to highlight the issue of morality and responsibility in these two areas by taking us back to the period of Hitler's Third Reich in Germany. If history has any lessons and examples for us to use to illumine our own day, this terrible era in German history should serve us well. In 1963, a West Berlin audience sat stunned before a play entitled The Deputy, which dealt with the Hitler years. It was written by a young German, Roth Hochhuth, who said he felt impelled to study the shameful history of his nation. The moral impact of that play has been felt by audiences around the world wherever The Deputy was shown. And I'd never heard of it, and was, be interesting. The Deputy was not an undersheriff, as years of exposure to that old TV show Gunsmoke might lead us to believe. Instead, it referred to Pope Pius XII, who was called the Deputy because he was God's representative on earth. So what did he do about the deaths of 6 million Jews? He kept silent for the most part. And Hochhuth felt impelled to write of this silence. This is the plot. Riccardo Fontana, a young Jesuit of influence at the Vatican, has been sent to Berlin in 1942. There, his ears are assaulted by the cries of 10,000 Jews a day who are being exterminated by the Nazis. He hears these cries through the person of a young Protestant who, as a German soldier, had seen the horrors of the extermination camps and has decided to do what he can to help. So he goes to the priest Fontana, who promises without any authority that the Vatican will protest the mass murders. "I give my guarantee. His Holiness will make a protest. I have the honor to know the Pope well." The high spot of the play is the scene between Fontana and Pope Pius XII, in which the priest pleads with him to break his silence about the plight of the Jews. The Pope tries to explain his neutrality, and the young priest finally realizes his mission is hopeless. The Pope does promise to make a statement, but this turns out to be a paragraph of glittering generalities that makes no specific mention of the Jews, but deplores the suffering of so many unfortunates without naming any country or even mentioning the deportation of Jews taking place beneath his very window. This statement is reported in the play exactly as it appeared in the Vatican newspaper of October 25th and 26th, 1943. By this time, the first 615 Jews from Rome had arrived at Auschwitz. Fontana denounces the Pope, pins the yellow Star of David to his cassock, and is next seen in Auschwitz comforting the Jews and sharing their fate to the end. Hochhuth is not anti-religious nor anti-Catholic. His play is dedicated to German and Polish Catholic priests, 2 of them, each of whom died a martyr's death because of their open identification with the plight of the Jews. He pointedly shows in the play that the Pope approved of hiding Jews in monasteries and cathedrals, and details the reasons the Pope gave for his neutrality. They were the fear of Nazi reprisal against the Church and Catholics in general, plus the fear of giving an advantage to Russia. The Pope feared communism more than Hitler, and he hoped that if he kept neutral, he might be an intermediary of peace between the warring nations. But Hochhuth finds it unbearable that millions of human beings from 1941 to 1945 went to their death in labor camps and gas chambers, and this included Catholics, even nuns and monks, abandoned by everyone, including the deputy of Christ. Hochhuth does not use the Pope's silence as an excuse for anyone else. He shows fully the complicity of Germans in all classes, the anti-Semitism of the Poles and the Russians, the indifference and the delays of the Western democracies, including ours. The play brings back the Nazi period not simply as a dead weight of a terrible, unchangeable past, but in relation to live options in ongoing history that continue to present tests of the same kind to us all. As Bruce McLean, a minister of the United Church of Christ, said in his review of this play, it is not a play about a pope in which the author hopes we will point a finger at that man secure in our ignorance. It's a play about us all who walk a bloody road from Jerusalem to Jericho, who hear cries for help all around, and who, for whatever reason, cannot or will not stop. Wrote Hochhuth says simply, pious is a symbol for all who are passive when their brother is harmed. Have you ever wondered what you might do if you had lived in Germany at the time? It's easy to point a finger from our safety across the ocean, but how many of us would have opposed Hitler openly or even secretly if we knew our actions, if detected, could mean our arrest, detention, torture, or even death of ourselves and our family? Fear or ignorance kept many German citizens silent while the atrocities were carried out. And why did not the great nations of England or the United States speak out, making public condemnation of what was happening in the concentration camps? It wasn't that they didn't know. Confidential information was leaked out to them before the general public ever knew. But in both nations, it was indifference, passiveness, and red tape that kept them from doing what Jewish leaders were pleading for them to do, to make a great worldwide ringing denunciation of genocide and to open their doors to any Jews who could escape or be smuggled out of Europe. But silence was maintained and the doors remained closed for most part. Our Secretary of State, Sumner Welles, rationalized our way out of this as ably as Pope Pius XII. And it has only been in the last decade, remember 1975, that the full story came out. But again, can we point a finger at leaders of that time without indicting ourselves? Do not we too often keep silence, try to avoid getting involved in some situation that might cause upset or discomfort to us? The classic example was in the murder of that young woman, Catherine Genovese, in New York City, where 38 people admitted later that they saw what was happening from their windows but did not want to be involved. Pious is indeed a symbol for all who are passive when someone else is harmed. It's useless for us to ask what we would have done if we had lived in the Third Reich, but it is very much to the point to ask ourselves if part of being morally responsible citizens today requires of us to speak out when we feel that wrong exists in some segment of our society, to become involved when injustice overtakes any individual or group. Being silent when something needs to be said to defend justice is surely one sure way to defeat a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, secondly, let us look at a man described as the most brilliant and gifted of Hitler's inner ring, Albert Speer. Speer was the young architect who was to create public buildings worthy of the grandeur of the Third Reich. He was to rebuild all of central Berlin with the object of making it the most stunning and gargantuan city in the world. Speer admitted it was quite a glittering prospect for a young man in his 20s. He envisioned himself as the most important architect Europe had ever produced. But until the war was over and such building could commence, he went up step by step to a high position where he was in virtual control of German economy, especially its war production. So brilliant was his management that it said his efforts alone prolonged the war for 2 years. But one basis for his success was his use of large masses of forced foreign labor. And when the war was over, he, along with 21 others, faced the world at the Nuremberg Court of Justice. He was convicted of this very charge, his use of forced labor. At his trial, he regretted that he had not looked into the moral implications of this, and that he had preferred not to hear about the concentration camps. Speer was not a rough, brutal man. He was of the elite upper middle class, a product of a group who should have stood against Hitler. But many of them fell prey to his glittering schemes as genteel collaborationists. In the first place, Speer profited by ignoring the moral implications of the Hitler era. Secondly, he belonged to that group of well-educated professional Germans who had been taught that life and politics were things apart, that the latter was fundamentally base, and that truly civilized man was above it all. In his memoirs written in prison, which I read and which is really an interesting book, where he served a life term for his collaboration with Hitler, Speer wrote, "Political events did not concern me. My job was to provide impressive backdrops for such events." Many things could be mentioned here in relationship to our task of being morally responsible in our own time. The temptation all of us face, as did Speer, is that when the status quo benefits us economically or otherwise, we find it difficult or even impossible to look at the whole scene objectively, especially if making changes might work against our well-being. Was this not the position often felt when white Southerners faced the slavery issue? Can it not be found in the open housing situation in the North today? None of us are overjoyed in facing the moral implications behind a situation that favors us while hurting others, yet at times the good of some situation or issue in the nation does conflict with our private goals and economic position. And is this not part of the whole question of equal education, integration, equal job opportunity? Speer, it is said, considered politics so far beneath him that he scarcely gave a thought to it. When the Watergate break-in occurred, with all the subsequent revealed political espionage, some editorials suggested that the American people were not particularly outraged, as they felt politics were so corrupt, so base, that they shrugged this off as merely another sign of confirmation. And on a recent survey, 1975, it was only used car salesmen who were thought to be more dishonest than politicians. Has that changed? Can we reflect that these can be dangerous signs in a democracy where people have this kind of weary resignation and find it hard to be morally alert and indignant over any particular wrong because they feel the whole thing is corrupt? Why get steamed up over this or that? Apathy can be dangerous in the maintaining of good government, as dangerous as foreign spies. Both take away the strength of a nation. A final point she brings up this morning centers around the question, why could such a thing as the Holocaust occur in a nation considered to be one of the most civilized and Christian in all the world? Allied with this is the attitude taken by many Americans that it could never happen here. It's difficult to think of the many devastating happenings that took place because of Hitler's final solution. Think of the unbelievable story of children in a Jewish orphanage in Warsaw who were ordered to come to the railroad station. Their destination was Treblinka, the dread concentration camp from which few ever escaped to tell its terrible story. The loving, kindly head of the orphanage, knowing there was no escape for his children, for the orphanage was under Nazi watch, and to keep them from panicking, had them march to the station to a gay tune played on the flute by a young boy who led them down the streets and up to the cattle cars. And though this man, who was the head of the orphanage, had been given a guarantee of personal safety, he destroyed it and went with his charges to their certain deaths. How could such brutal insensitivity take place? Gunter Levy speaks for countless historians when he says that to understand what happened, we must realize that, quote, the Nazi assault upon the Jews of Europe took place in a climate of opinion conditioned by centuries of Christian hostility to Jews and Judaism, unquote. In short, he explains the monstrous brew which Hitler gave his nation to drink was not a sudden or modern concoction of his own. Quote, the ugly brew of anti-Semitism had been simmering on the back burners of Europe over 1,000 years, boiling over from time to time in fiery pogroms. Where hatred of Jews was the strongest, Germany, Poland, Russia, Hitler was able to carry out his program with the least local opposition, unquote. And there is no way to gloss over the blame which has rested on Christianity through the centuries of history. Mr. Levy quotes statement after statement from the Catholic prelates or from books and articles approved by the church attributing to the Jews a demoralizing influence in the religious and national life of these countries. Bishop Hilfrich of Limburg summed up centuries of anti-Semitism in his Lenten letter of 1939 in this statement, quote, the Jewish people were guilty of the death of God and have been put under a curse since the day of the crucifixion, unquote. So, when Hitler began his work of genocide, centuries of anti-Semitism lay behind the silence of the Vatican, reflecting deep feelings of both Catholics and Protestants. The Pope knew well that the German Catholics were not willing to incur the wrath of their Nazi rulers for the sake of the Jews, whom their own bishops for years had castigated as a deadly, harmful influence in German life. Tragic to relate, it took the death of over 6 million people to force the Christian world to examine the monstrous phenomenon of anti-Semitism and try to begin to eradicate it by actually changing the words in some Catholic rituals and hymns, especially those used at the Easter season. And many Protestant groups are, 1975, re-examining their Sunday church school materials. Could anything of that nature ever happen here? We cannot say absolutely not. We can only say perhaps not. But the lesson seems to be that whenever we allow fear or ignorance or prejudice to dominate our feelings about others, whenever we think there is a loophole in the admonition, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, we are sowing seeds of trouble for the future. Whatever history may teach us or not teach us, it certainly sheds light on the assumption that a nation grows best in an atmosphere where good government and good citizenship are taken seriously, and morality and responsibility are accepted as guiding principles for all. Thank you, Ruth Smith.